Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cutrara, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more transformative, meaningful, and inclusive for their students. During these pandemic times, I've been doing a series talking with people in the history community, historians, archivists, comic book creators, museum people, about what it might be like to teach history in these pandemic times, both during the moment we're in right now and after, when we get back into our more formal classrooms. And today we have another amazing guest. I just feel so privileged to be able to talk with so many awesome people. We're going to talk to Dr. Sean Carleton. Sean is a historian, he's a history professor, he has written some awesome things in popular media like Canadian Dimensions. His particular focus is on settler-colonial relations and also the history of schooling, which I just feel like is such an awesome moment right now to be able to talk about those things. So let's go over to Zoom and talk to Sean. Hey Sean, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I know that you're busy teaching, and so it's been great to be able to schedule a time to talk. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation. Really happy to chat.
So I've been asking people 3 questions, and it's really about our present about teaching history, the future of teaching history, and then this notion of imagining or kind of community history. So let's just dive right into the first one, but we can kind of take some roots back and forth between the 3 if you want. So
Sure.
Have you thought of history any differently because of this moment? Because I know I have. Have you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As a historian of Indigenous settler relations, I'm always trying to guide students to a better understanding of the present and dreaming of what might be in terms of the future, how to improve Indigenous settler relations, how to work towards reconciliation, whatever that would look like, and grounding that in an awareness of the past. So in some ways, I'm always thinking about the present and the future through the lens of the past and asking students to do that. I think what's so unusual about this situation is that the future seems so uncertain. In terms of Indigenous settler relations, when I'm trying to lead students, for the most part, from not knowing a lot about Indigenous settler relations, these founding agreements, nation to nation, and I'm trying to get them to the point where in the present they can see how understanding all of that history can help them do better and work towards something attainable. Right now, it seems like the future is so uncertain that it's hard to figure out what's the future of Indigenous settler relations post-pandemic. What will that look like? How can Canadians prioritize rebuilding society in some ways that don't leave Indigenous settler relations and those founding agreements behind? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And I think that's what's so unsettling in maybe a good and a bad way.
Something we talked about offline was that during these moments of crisis, you can really see how Canada is structured, right? And I think, and you brought up how important it is to recognize this Indigenous settler relations in these moments. And it's kind of interesting that it might not have shifted your perspective of history, but that if we think of that lens, then we can really see how history is playing out in the present because of these absences, these silences, and things that that we are hearing and the things that we aren't.
Absolutely. I think moments of disaster, of crisis, sort of reveal who you are, how society works, what its priorities are. And I think teaching Indigenous settler relations this semester has been very interesting because we're in the midst of Wet'suwet'en solidarity protests, shutdown. The history that we were teaching through come to life, the kinds of core issues. And it was a really fertile moment, I think, for me and my students to kind of walk through and understand how an awareness of that history can really help us kind of think through the present and dream of better futures. And then very quickly, Indigenous settler relations, got lost in the pandemic, which I thought was quite interesting, because I was trying to make arguments in February and March about Shut Down Canada being an opportunity for Canadians to learn about these core issues and understand how colonialism continues to influence the present, not just the past, right? And yet when the pandemic broke out, Canadians' attention, very quickly moved away from issues of the environment and our fundamental relationships to these lands. And I think it revealed a lot about our priorities in sort of uncomfortable ways. And I felt like students really wanted to talk through that. But in the shift to online learning, I was still developing and delivering content, but I didn't have the opportunity to really talk with students about some of those really interesting issues about what this says about Indigenous settler relations, because colonialism doesn't stop because there's a pandemic. The Coastal Gas Link work is continuing under the cover of the coronavirus crisis. And most Canadians don't know, a lot of mainstream media aren't paying a lot of attention to that. So I think that does say something interesting about the relationship between history, the present, and the future, and what our priorities are in these moments.
But also it's, when you're saying colonialism doesn't stop, it's also a matter of things like access and equity, right? What are the assumptions that we are making about who and what a Canadian is, or a person in Canada is, and what they need right now? Those are based in very colonial assumptions about a Canadian community. And that is not many people's experiences. It wasn't before, but it certainly isn't now.
I think you raised something really interesting, in the sense that what I was trying to teach students about Shut Down Canada was that the way that people talk about these kinds of issues is that it's Canada versus Indigenous people.
Right.
And the only way that kind of rhetoric gains traction is by people's own ignorance around how Canada is structured, right? To think that Canada is a country of two founding people, French and English, and like Indigenous people are like sort of a colonized subordinate minority. That's not how Canada functions, right? Canada is built on these nation-to-nation relationships that include Indigenous people as part of that kind of that fabric of what peaceful coexistence was supposed to look like. And Shut Down Canada kind of showed us that core relationship of working nation to nation isn't working. And yet the pandemic is an interesting example where people are able to come together and make sacrifices and try and think in more compassionate ways about who is included. And yet Indigenous people, not surprisingly to me, are being left out of that conversation. It's okay, now we have to focus on the health of Canadians, and Indigenous communities are saying, okay, well, you need to honor your nation-to-nation agreements. Many communities are vulnerable, we need help. And it's like, okay, well, we'll send you some tents, good luck. I think, again, that shows that there are gaps in how we think of Canadian society, and how Indigenous people are often left out of those conversations to the detriment of working together in peaceful and reciprocal ways in these lands.
I think of another video that we did right at the beginning of this series with Neil Orford about the Spanish flu, and how he was saying how important it was to talk about Indigenous peoples and their experiences with the Spanish flu in the Defining Moments Canada project. And he brings up the historical thinking concept of continuity and change. And so did Jan Haskins Winter, who's another person that, who's another educator that I interviewed. And people that watch the video know that I kind of have issues with the historical thinking concept, but if we are just going to use the continuity and change one, this is an interesting moment to do the continuity and change of a kind of Canadian nation-to-nation response to pandemic issues and the support of different nations. But I mean, you know, this is kind of separate from this conversation. One of my issues with the historical thinking approach is that it doesn't really incite action. And I think that we can be in it to be able to look right now for, sure, continuity and change, but then we need to take that extra step for action. And I think that teachers can really connect with their students right now about doing some of that research and looking at ways to advocate for greater Indigenous and settler relationship right now in order to have that kind of greater understanding of what Canada could be with greater nation-to-nation relations. I know that like historical thinking isn't like, you're not in that world as much, but I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, my response would be that, you know, the way that we teach Canadian history often marginalizes Indigenous people, even if we're trying to foreground that history.
Yes,
the way
good point.
that we teach Canadian history places an emphasis on Canada, its structures, its development. And I think that that's, you know, constitutionally, that's not even accurate in terms of understanding, you know, the Royal Proclamation, the Treaty of Niagara, the establishment of this this nation-to-nation relationship that is the core, the bedrock of what this country was supposed to be, and yet in practice, you know, has never really, you know, actually emerged as that. And it's just another opportunity to showcase how, you know, things like the pandemic show us that the way that Canadians think of Canada continues to deviate from that kind of nation-to-nation relationship. How many health officials, premiers, politicians were first and foremost, you know, having conversations about maintaining our treaty responsibilities in these times. Instead, you know, Indigenous people continue to get kind of marginalized. It's like Canadians become focused on themselves in these times, which is true. I mean, like everybody's worried. I'm worried about, you know, the health of myself and my family. But I think it does show that, you know, our commitment to reconciliation is pretty shallow in this moment, because as soon as something else happens, you know, we completely ignore those responsibilities. We couldn't, you know, I think it would have been an interesting moment if coming out of shutdown Canada, going into the pandemic, if politicians had said, you know, we're wanting to maintain those relationships as we respond to this pandemic, talking about treaty responsibilities. I mean, there's a clause in Treaty 6 that that many treaty people in that territory were trying to invoke, saying, you know, we have treaty responsibilities here in terms of medical provisions that most people have. I mean, they don't even know there's a treaty, let alone intricate. And I think that reveals something perhaps unsettling about our priorities as Canadians, as settlers, in these moments, that we say we're committed to doing different, and then when we're given the opportunity, whether it be shut down Canada or now our response to the pandemic, it just reveals that is fairly surface level and shallow, which is both disappointing and an opportunity to perhaps change that.
And so, like, the second question is about teaching history after this. And do you think there will be a change? Do you think that, I mean, in terms of content or delivery or having more fodder to explore this, do you think there'll be a change after this? Or what will that change be?
Yeah, I mean, I try to think of the way that I teach history, kind of, you know, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. You know, trying to um, trying to get students to understand that history can teach us a number of different lessons that can guide us in terms of our response to the present and try and create better futures. And I think in that way, I don't really see the way that I teach history changing, and yet it seems pretty unlikely that the way that I teach won't be affected. Because as historians, as people, you can't, we make our own history, but not in conditions of our own choosing. So we have, we respond to what we're going through. It does shape the way that we do what we do. And so I think in terms of how the pandemic will shape the way that we teach history, I think there will be some delivery changes, and how we prepare for those in some ways, sort of the nitty-gritty of the mechanics of the way that we teach. But I guess my core teaching that I try to infuse whatever I'm teaching is kind of learning from the past to better understand the present, to create a better future. I think in some ways that will make that core idea, that we need to continually learn from the past to try and think of better futures. I think that teaching is more relevant coming out of the pandemic. And I've been recently reading Asilt Jones's book on the 1918-19 influenza, and I see that teaching in this book, which is what happened was devastating, particularly to working class or marginalized communities, and yet there is inspiration. After the influenza, working class people were more willing to fight for a better future in the streets of Winnipeg in the 1919 general strike. That a lot of that organizing and wanting to dream of a better world inspires political organizing in the 20s and into the 30s and 40s. So I think there's lots of examples of teaching through crisis that can provide some hope and inspiration, and try and getting people to think about, if you want to dream of a better world, you first have to understand how that world was created and what in some ways how it works, so that you can figure out ways to make it work better.
Yeah, and I think it's also about pulling new stories, being open to finding and looking for and pulling those new stories from the past, right? Sure, teachers might come in now and teach about the Spanish flu, but those links between working class struggles afterwards, is that going to be brought up as much? Because that can really align with a lot of students' experiences with their own families. I think that this pandemic demonstrates a real failure of, or could demonstrate for some people, a real failure of capitalism to take care of small businesses, to take care of a large population, and that we can use history to demonstrate working class struggles, for example, always in identifying where the issues that we're having now, where the roots of that history is too.
Yeah, and I think in listening to the conversations that have been going on the past couple of weeks, I think that this debate over, is our society structured around the idea of people before profit or profit before people?
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that there's actually a tension, that I think a lot of people, want to prioritize society over profit. And yet the way that we've structured our society makes that very difficult in many ways. Mm-hmm. And I think the pandemic might provoke some interesting questions, both in the present and future, but also of the past. I'm reading Asilt's book and thinking, wow, it's so different than what we're going through now, and yet people 100 years ago were asking very similar kinds of questions.
Yeah.
If you don't have a properly functioning healthcare system, when a crisis hits, things are going to get pretty bad, but not bad for everybody. some people will be able to afford better kinds of care, and the people that are affected most by the pandemic will be marginalized, vulnerable communities. So I think that the kinds of questions that people are raising now and trying to think through in terms of what kind of future we want to have, I think we can learn a lot from the past and applying some of those same questions to grapple with how people responded to moments of crisis and disaster. That might give us some clues about how we might grow towards a better kind of future today. I'm hopeful that that can happen.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. And that leads to my last question about this notion of imagining a new we. What do you think this imagining or this we might look like, if at all, if that's a concept that resonates with you after this moment?
Yeah, I guess as a bald white guy teaching Indigenous settler relations, I'm always acutely aware of the we. Who's included in that? And I guess part of the teaching that I do is understanding how the we is complicated in colonial settings. Who's included, who's not included, when and why, and who benefits most from those kinds of exclusions and exclusions. And I guess my view is that the we, both in the past, present, and future in Indigenous settler relations, isn't a sort of melting pot we, but rather a sort of nation to nation peaceful coexistence we, that we are, that Canadian settler society and Indigenous nations exist in parallel, and that we doesn't collapse that, but rather maintains that parallel nature, and it finds ways to mutually reinforce it rather than abandon it, which I think we're seeing in these kinds of moments. We're making some progress, although we can debate that, towards reconciliation, and then all of a sudden the pandemic breaks out and we're sending body bags and tents to Indigenous communities. That isn't a kind of reinforcing of that kind of parallel nation-to-nation relationship. It's sort of like, well, we're going to double down on protecting Canadians first. So I think in coming out of this pandemic, it might be an opportunity. That's what I'm trying to argue, is that the pandemic is another opportunity, at least in terms of Indigenous settler relations, to say that our response to the pandemic needs to also ensure that our treaty responsibilities, our nation-to-nation relationships are being upkept, that Canadians are also, they're looking around the world in terms of what can we do to help places like Italy or Spain, the United States even. How can we help their response? Okay, well, what about your treaty partners? What about Indigenous communities? Right. We, Canadian society, needs to understand that in these moments, Canada also has responsibilities to Indigenous nations. That's what this country is supposed to be founded on. And yet we don't do that often. And I think that's sort of that double-edged sword. We can either say, well, I guess we'll just abandon it and we'll pick up reconciliation in 18 months. But I think more optimistically, it's an opportunity to ensure that those responsibilities don't get dropped in times of crises, that we don't get distracted by worrying just about our own family, but in trying to think of our relations more broadly to ensure that our commitments to reconciliation and nation-to-nation relations can actually be strengthened in these moments. Like if we can, find $100 billion to ensure that businesses can pay out their workers, well, then our arguments about not being able to find money for clean drinking water and working nation to nation to ensure that Indigenous kids aren't being discriminated on reserve, we can do that.
Right.
That's a decision we can make if we prioritize it. And so I like to think that pointing out the gaps in our response isn't just because I'm a mean person or, you know, I want to make Canada look bad. It's an opportunity to say, I like that there's more, we need more kitty.
Sorry, we did just get a visitor. Yeah, sorry.
I was wondering if one of my two would come, but they're asleep right now. It's nap time. You know, I guess, you know, to kind of wrap that up, I hope that this isn't an opportunity to push snooze on, you know, another opportunity for Canadians to respond differently. You know, we didn't do very well, honestly, as a country during Shutdown Canada. We resorted to ignorance, misinformation, not learning the lessons of the past to respond in gracious ways. But we can continuously learn to respond in different ways. And I think that during a pandemic, you know, my hope is that nation-to-nation relations, you know, isn't something that seems marginal, but can continuously be brought in as a priority. And that might be a stepping stone in once we get out of the pandemic, that we can point to that as something that has changed since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is so, it just brings up so many interesting things to think about, and also I think to act upon. And during this moment when teachers, for example, aren't seeing their students, you know, face to face, and that they have time, I mean, although a lot of teachers are also parents, and so, like, you know, but to be able to do some more research and think about their own narratives and how that can be brought into the classroom in order to advocate for greater action and greater advocacy for what a nation-to-nation relationship would look like, and our responsibilities as Canadians to push our governments to kind of ensure that. So thank you so much for really being so clear in bringing those issues to the fore. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, it's an opportunity. I think, you know, it's an opportunity to envision the kind of society that we want to build after this. And my hope is that nation-to-nation relationships don't get abandoned in that we can include that in our conversations. And if we can do that, I think we'll continue to make progress towards reconciliation. If not, you know, I'm worried that all of the work that we've done in the last 10 years, you know, that Canada will teach Indigenous communities that when push comes to shove, you know, they're not really interested in strengthening those relationships. And I worry about that. So I hope that we can take this opportunity to focus, to ask new questions, to learn more, read more, but also to widen our ability to be compassionate around the world, but also to Indigenous communities across Canada.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really, I think it's useful, and useful in the way that you're articulating it. And I think it's going to have a lot of resonance for teachers and other people watching these videos. So thank you so much for taking the time to be able to talk with us and to be able to explore these issues more during these times, these odd times that we're all trying to get our footing on, and thinking about using this as a way to build a stronger future, I think, is such an important takeaway.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to do something other than Zoom lectures and respond to panicked emails. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let me know if there are, or let me know what resources you want to share with teachers. I'll provide a link below. And of course, we can always keep this conversation going, because I think this will be really useful, and I can only imagine how useful teachers will find it. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. I hope your cats wake up from their nap so you can talk. Yeah,
they're soon going to want some treats. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. See you later. Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Samantha.
Wow, what a great conversation. It was so awesome to talk with Sean, and to be able to really think about settler and Indigenous relations in this moment. I don't know if you heard that cat behind me. You know, one of the things that I took from it is about we can really use this moment to think about how the world is changing because of something we didn't expect, and how our expectations of what the world is supposed to be like, how that can shift too, and that we can use this moment to be able to do more research and more thinking, like just more thinking about this, and then think about ways we can bring this into our classrooms, because it will be stressful going back into the classrooms, and there'll be this like what's the word I'm looking for? There'll be this desire to kind of get back to normal in a way that could gloss over the real learning opportunities that this moment shows. And if we go back to Neil's video about the Spanish flu, like Indigenous and settler relations, like that was an issue then, and how can we leave this moment even stronger than when we left in 1918 related to these things. So I hope you took that too, and how useful this moment can be for rethinking the world that we want. Let me know if it does. It'd be great to have a conversation with you, just like I had it with Sean and Neil and Jan and all these other great people, and great people I have lined up as well for next week. So let me know if you want to be one of them. 3 questions. What do you think about now in terms of the present in teaching? What do you think about the future? And how or if we can imagine a new we in different ways because of this. Have a great day, everyone, and stay home. Bye.